Welcome, everyone. I'm Morgana Angeli, one of the founders of Reset Revolution, and I'm joined today by Christian Shushok. And we're going to be discussing the lost cause of the Southern states in America specifically, but it will get a little broader as we go along. So, Christian, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. First off, I just want to thank y'all for having me. I follow the work you've been doing on Instagram, and y'all are talking to a lot of important people. So I'm really appreciative seeing all the stuff that you get to do. But yeah, I guess I'll introduce myself real quick. My name is Christian. I just graduated from high school last year in the midst of the pandemic. I currently go to a small college called the University of the South, coincidentally, in Swanee, Tennessee. I run a group called Appalachian Youth Climate Coalition that helps young people in the mountains of the southern United States kind of get involved with activism and helps train them to fight for their own homes, environments, etc. So that's what I'm really involved in with my free time. I'm also a pretty big advocate for Appalachian and Southern culture. I've written a couple articles about it, which you can find on my Instagram page that I'm sure will be tagged in this video if anybody's interested. But yeah, thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So, for the people watching who might not know where Appalachia is or what are the stigmas and stereotypes that come with being Appalachian, do you want to describe that a little bit for our viewers?
Yeah, sure. I'm used to talking to an only American audience, so I'm going to try and kind of break it down as easily as I can. But if I don't go over anything, feel free to prompt me because, like I said, I'm used to talking to Americans. So Appalachia is a cultural region in the United States that's loosely defined by the presidents of the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachian Mountains actually run south from around almost to the southern coast, kind of in Georgia and Mississippi, and run all the way up to Canada. But Appalachia as a cultural region is actually much smaller than that and runs through the southern United States and ends in southern New York, kind of right below New York City by about 100 miles. And Appalachia for a long time has been a very unique region of the United States. The mountains that are there have created a very individualistic culture, and we even have our own dialect of American English. You'll hear certain words that you won't hear other places, like holler is a word you might hear, and that means like a little, it's like a little cove or cutout in the mountains where somebody might build a cabin or live. So if you're in Appalachia ever, you might hear somebody say like, "Hey, come on down to my holler. We'll make some sweet tea," something like that. And yeah, so it's a very unique cultural region. We have our own music too, that takes a lot of different influences. Black Americans contributed really a lot to bluegrass music, which is the music of Appalachia. They actually lent us the banjo, which comes over from Africa. And then that kind of mixed with all the various different cultures of European settlers and Native Americans that kind of inhabited the region. And so even today, the region is very isolated, much more rural than other areas of the United States, and has this very unique cultural identity that people are fiercely defensive of. Unfortunately, because of that isolation and the way that we've been viewed over time, there's also a lot of negative stereotypes that we are inbred, stupid, toothless. And you know, I'm pretty stupid, but I wouldn't say I'm inbred or toothless right now. And a lot of those stereotypes are really harmful for the people in the region, especially because there's been a lot of systemic oppression here. We're disproportionately low income compared to the rest of the country. And in the past 100 years, coal mining and other extractive industries were a really big deal. So a lot of our people have sacrificed their lives to dig out coal that powered American factories or dig out timber that built American buildings. And unfortunately, while our region was full of riches, they were extracted and sent elsewhere, and we never really got to reap the economic benefit. So we're still disproportionately poorer than the rest of the nation. I hope that's a little bit of a breakdown. I don't know if that's good enough.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and it helps set the tone for the rest of our conversation to come. So how do you think that these stereotypes, or rather the idea of the Southern lost cause, how do you think this affects the youth, specifically in Appalachia, but also in Southern states?
Yeah, so I think that when you look at stereotypes, they do some really vicious cultural work. And to understand the American South and where those stereotypes come from, you really have to go back to the American Civil War. And so for those who may not know, the American Civil War was a event in which the southern states of the United States, Virginia included, tried to secede from the Union because they wanted to maintain the system of slavery, where they would enslave African Americans in order to do primarily agricultural work in southern states. This was largely because southern states had an economy that was very agricultural and rural, and slave labor was the cheapest way for the ruling class to make money, while northern states had an industrial economy that was primarily focused on factories, so slave labor was not nearly as big of a factor. Now, obviously, we should start this off by saying that the institution of slavery was an atrocity. The effects of it still affect Black Americans every single day. We have mass incarceration. We have lower income brackets for Black Americans disproportionately. We have police shootings. Racism is very, very much still an issue. But that Civil War really set the South apart as this area of the United States that was seen as culturally different. And as time evolved, there were a lot of issues with the South. So we were very pro-segregation, and we were very pro-Jim Crow. And a lot of Southern leaders continued to maintain systems of oppression for Black Americans, even up until today. But where you get to the issue of stereotypes is not everyone in the South falls into that bracket. And those stereotypes actually really hurt those of us who are fighting for a better South and a better future. So for example, one thing you'll read in American media a lot is people say like, oh, I wish we didn't have the South. They're all so stupid and poor, right? But the Southern United States has a higher percentage of Black people than any other area in all of America. And so when we write off the South as this area that is, kind of a lost cause, that it used to be great back during the time of the Confederacy. Some people say that, but now today, it's really just poor and destitute and not worth our time. We think that we're attacking the racism that used to be there, but in reality, we end up attacking lots of low income and marginalized people that really need our support, especially Black Americans who live in the Southern United States. One of the Southern United States that gets criticized the most is Mississippi, and Mississippi is the Blackest state in America. And so that's really hard for a lot of Southerners to continually hear that their region of the country isn't worthwhile and we need to just get rid of it because it's all full of a bunch of inbred, backwards people. When, there's people like me and many of my friends and many incredible people who are Southerners and continue to fight for a better future. Appalachia has a really deep history of labor organizing. There was a lot of socialists and communists and different people who tried to mobilize coal miners to make American labor more sustainable and better for the workers. Martin Luther King Jr., who was an American civil rights icon, was actually the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a bunch of Southern pastors that actually came together to fight for equal rights for Black Americans. So if you look at Southern history, you really don't have to look too far to find those that are fighting for justice. And growing up as a young person there, a lot of times you're told that you can't do those things because you are a Southerner, and there's this expectation of you being backwards and racist and politically conservative. And if we put that expectation on people, that is the thing that they become. So we need to start expecting more from the South if we're going to have youth that are going to become activists and move on.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to look at it as a European because I think we see what the media wants to show us, at least here. I've never been to the States, so everything I know about the States is what my friends tell me or what I see in the news, what I see on TikTok, stuff like that. And I do think that the South is portrayed quite negatively, especially during the Trump elections, where a lot of the red states were Southern states. But within those states, if you go to look, there were a lot of blue parts, regions of the states, and people were just generalizing that all Southern states are for Trump, all Southern states are negative, but it's in fact not true. It's just the generalization of events that the media just pushes on people to bring forward this idea of South bad, North good.
Yeah, and I mean, my home state of Texas, it did go red this election, but just barely. And next election, a lot of people are expecting it to actually flip blue. The state where I grew up and is also my other home state, Virginia, actually did go blue this election. And then another very prominent Southern state, Georgia, actually also flipped blue. So the notion that, Southern states are red and very much Trump country, that's not unfactual. We have a lot of Trump supporters here, but the difference is you can acknowledge that it's conservative and still believe in its capacity to change. I think that's what we've been seeing through Georgia. I think that's what we're seeing in Virginia. I think that's what we're fixing to see in Texas. So I'm excited. I'm hopeful. But yeah, I think that it's definitely how the media portrays it, and you have to be aware of that when evaluating the South.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of globalized this thing. If you look at Italy, for example, that's my home country. It's divided. So there's north of Italy, central Italy, and then southern Italy. And the northern Italy, for a long while, they had a political party that was called Lega Nord, which means Northern League, and they wanted to just dissociate themselves from the South. And there's a lot of stereotypes about Southern Italians that are really negative, and I think could parallel the negative stereotypes of Southern Americans. And there's always that connotation of South bad, but you have to go look at the history, like you were mentioning before, where, for example, in the South, a lot of more people might vote for Trump or might vote more conservative, but it is because they are the ones that are most negatively impacted by globalization, by all these changing things that maybe more democratic parties or more liberal parties are trying to push on the nation. So it's hard to just look at this without knowing everything before it, because you're just going to fall into the trap of generalizing, of just understanding what you're told instead of actually looking behind the reasons why that's happening, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm actually somewhat familiar. I'm somewhat familiar with the events of the Northern League, and I've actually read about the different stereotypes and conflict between Southern Italy and Northern Italy. I know that a lot of the urban centers are in Northern Italy, while Southern Italy is agricultural. And I have some good Italian friends back home that have told me all about, kind of the conflict that happens there. And I would say that it's very parallel. And as an Italian, I'm sure you would probably agree that the stereotypes about Southern Italy are far from accurate for all of Southern Italy. But yeah.
So speaking about stereotypes, what are the most common misconceptions about the South, beyond the ones that you already mentioned?
Um, I think that you already touched on some of them, but two that I just want to go over, even though I've talked about them before, are the first thing is that the South is completely conservative and completely white. And we already touched on why those things are not true. It's a very diverse place, but sometimes the media only chooses to focus on our white residents. The other issue that I think happens a lot is we assume that people from the South are less intelligent and less motivated to get things done. So especially when you hear people with like a really thick Southern draw, obviously we say y'all. We have other words that people don't use internationally in international English. I would I would guess that you probably were not taught the Southern dialect when you learned to speak English overseas, um, which of course is understandable, but we need to remember that the way that people speak and the accents that come with them, one accent is not inherently superior. So if you're going to talk with a super thick drawl from the South, that's fine. You can do that, and it doesn't mean that you're any less worth or that you are lazier than any other group of Americans. So I think a lot of times, culturally, the Southern lifestyle is slower. We enjoy doing things like sitting on porches and drinking sweet tea and having good conversation. And a lot of people in the South really value ruralty and places that don't have a lot of residents. So there are parts of that lifestyle that are true. We like a slow pace of things. We like to take our time and stop and smell the roses, if you will. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, but that doesn't mean that we're any less motivated to get things done. And we also want to contribute to American society and global society. And along with that, sometimes people overseas think that Southerners have no interest in them, or have no interest in kind of being internationally minded and kind of cosmopolitan, when in reality the issue is that a lot of people in the South simply can't afford financially to go overseas or to travel. So we sometimes hear things like, oh, well, I bet you he's been in that same little town all of his life. And that is true. Some people spend their entire life in the same county, and it's not because they want to, it's because they don't have the money to leave. All their money goes back into just keeping themselves alive. And a lot of that has to do with systemic problems that are in America. And it's not Southerners' fault that they don't have the money for health care, they don't have the money for adequate food, or they don't have the money to travel. That's the fault of broken systems in our society. And sometimes we place that on lower income people, especially in the South, especially in communities of color, especially marginalized groups, when really we need to recognize that those are institutional problems, not personal problems. It's not due to my motivation, it's due to the opportunities I've been given in life. So, yeah.
I completely agree with everything you said, and I think it's really commendable how you know so much, and you're coming here and you're saying the truth, and you're telling how it really is, and I think that's something really important. Um, One of the questions that was asked before this interview was, do you think people still view the cause of the Confederate States as heroic or moral?
Mm. Yeah. So, um, you just told me that I was here to tell the truth, so I am going to tell the truth. The answer to that is both yes and no. It depends on who you ask, just like any other political issue. So, the first thing that we need to acknowledge about that is that not everyone in the South operates with the same set of facts. So, the American education system, as I'm sure you've probably read, oftentimes is inadequate. And personally, I think that the cause of the Confederacy was atrocious and the things that it did to Black Americans were terrible. But you will meet a lot of people that still fly the Confederate flag, that still believe the Confederacy was a good thing. And that's kind of where the lost cause name comes from, is people used to say, oh, well, it's a lost cause, but maybe one day the South will rise again. People still say that. You'll meet people that say stuff like that. And I think part of that is, one is that there's a misconception that the war was about something other than slavery, that it was about Southern independence, because the North had slaves too, is what people say. And that's true. The North did have slaves, but fundamentally, the Civil War was a war about the right to own other individuals as property. And the South was on the wrong side of that war. And we need to recognize collectively as Southerners that we were in the wrong, but that doesn't mean that everything about us is forever wrong, right? We can recognize that we've made mistakes in the past, but also be looking towards a brighter future. Because the pastors, some of which were white, that stood with Martin Luther King when he was arguing for civil rights in America, they recognized that and they moved on past it. But it's still widely prevalent that people do believe in the Confederacy. And I'm here arguing, for the good parts of the South and trying to tell people that stereotypes aren't everything, but stereotypes are based on fact, right? And so when people say, well, the South is all racist, right? That's not true, but we do have a race problem. And we need to look at that critically and recognize that there are misconceptions, both historically and presently, about the way we view the Confederacy that have to be acknowledged before we can move on as a region.
What would you suggest people around the world can do within their own countries and communities? Because as we've seen, it's an international problem because it happens in a lot of countries, the divide between South and North, but also to help with spreading this awareness of the South not being a lost cause and, empowering people.
Yeah. So I think the first thing that people need to do is first, if you can, you have the time. If you're going to understand America as a whole, you really have to understand its regions, right? You have to understand how Appalachia was taken advantage of. You have to understand the lost cause of the Confederacy. And that starts with reading history. Educate yourself, make sure you know kind of what these historical issues were about, and then bring that in and look at issues of the present day. So when talking about America and making comments, make sure you recognize that all Americans don't suffer equally, right? Like Native Americans and people of color by far have disproportionate societal structures that are against them. But people in Appalachia, for example, also have societal structures that are against them. And it's important to kind of, when looking at America, look at all these different regions and all these different cultures, and remember that the institutions both that we have domestically and internationally affect all of us in different ways. So personally, I myself am very fortunate. I never have really had to struggle for getting food or anything I really needed throughout my upbringing, my childhood. But many people around me in my area of the nation are not so fortunate. And so when we write off people like Southerners or even like Trump supporters as not deserving of basic human rights, basic civil liberties, basic resources that you need to survive, that's really damaging to us. And so the international community really needs to, whenever they can, let our government know and let other people know that we have self-worth, and just kind of continue to promote that whenever you can. I also want to acknowledge that, like, if you're in, Belgium or Italy, you're probably not discussing the American South all that often, but you probably are discussing American politics and Trump supporters every now and again, just because I know that's kind of a global thing that people see and laugh at us for, which we deserve most of the time. So yeah, just remember those kind of cultural nuances when having those discussions, and if you can, educate your friends.
Have you ever been affected by the stereotype of the lost cause of the South? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I have. I use some Southern dialect. I have a little twang to my voice every now and again. I wear cowboy boots when I go out and dress in a way that is, indicative of what an American Southerner would be. Um, and I think that with that sometimes comes judgments that aren't necessarily true for who I am. I've had people assume that, I was a far right Trump supporter, which isn't true. I've had people assume that I had racial prejudices that were affecting my day to day life, which I think that everybody has everybody has racial prejudices they need to analyze for themselves, but I don't think that was true for me. I don't think I go out into, society every single day. I think what they thought was that I was looking for ways to be a racist, and that's definitely not true for me. Um, and that was really unfortunate. And I think that had to do with the way I talked and the way I dressed. I've had people, this is more related to me being in Appalachia, but when I visited northern states in the country, I had a woman ask me to smile so she could see how many teeth I had. Um, yeah, so I mean, like, all that stuff is small pennies to the abuse that a lot of people of color and other marginalized groups face every day, but um, it definitely, those stereotypes are there, and you can sense them if you're a Southerner or an Appalachian.
Yeah, and when speaking about minority groups, you always mention and refer back to Native Americans or African Americans, but also class has to do a lot with minorities. And you were speaking about how the South is usually an economic minority in the States. So, as a minority economically, how do you think that has affected people's opportunities to then get out of the Southern states or get out of the stereotypes that are being imposed on them?
Yeah. So obviously the South as a whole, and especially, Appalachia disproportionately is very, very low income, and that's a problem. And one of the issues that we actually face is this notion that if you're intelligent, if you're driven, if you're a hard worker, you're going to make it out. Where some of us, like myself, I don't want to leave Appalachia. I want to make a life here, and I need the resources to be able to make a life here. I need jobs that I can make a life in my own region, right? I want to make a life in these mountains. And we're looked upon as all that hard work is supposed to get you out, while some of us want to work hard to actually stay. And that's something that's kind of unfortunate. And like you said, I always refer back to, these racial minorities, because really they are bearing the brunt of America's economic system. But like I said, the South and Appalachia, these disproportionate class disparities really are terrible for a lot of us. And if you drive through areas of Appalachia, like the coal fields, like, you're going to see poverty like you've never seen before. Like poverty like you've never seen before, probably anywhere else in America, for a lot of people that are from wealthier areas, and that can be really, really troubling. And the truth of the matter is that the people here, in large part, are forgotten, and we need government intervention. We need economic support if we're going to be able to not just make it out. Some people want to make it out, and some people want to stay, and both of those are valid options, and we need to remember that both of those are important. So it's important to help people kind of have their own economic self-determination. And there's only so much that I as an individual can do, where I can work hard and make money, but at a certain point I need healthcare, I need resources. Lots of the South is a food desert. I need adequate dining options for myself and my family, right? And just remember that a lot of the choices that we make are influenced by the systems that we have to play into.
Yeah, speaking about the politics and the economic system behind it, do you think anything is going to change with the change in presidency?
Yeah, I'm always hopeful. I think the only thing I can ever be is hopeful. But I think I hoped that the Obama presidency was going to change things for Appalachia, and then I hoped that the Trump presidency was going to change things for Appalachia, and neither one of those happened. So I really hope the Biden presidency can start to do something, but I think it's important that we hold him accountable. So last year, for example, Joe Biden said there were coal miners that were complaining about losing their jobs. And Joe Biden said, anybody who can throw coal into a furnace can learn to program for computers. Which, yeah, that would be a great option if we could all learn to do computer science and work remotely in Appalachia. But unfortunately, 1/4 of people in Appalachia don't have home internet. So I would say we want to change, we want to have a better economy, but if people like Joe Biden are going to say those things, they also need to be accountable and actually help get broadband internet in our communities, because we don't have broadband internet in a lot of these rural areas. And so people can't educate themselves. They can't get online jobs like we're being pressured to do. And I think specifically with the COVID-19 crisis and how we've seen that you really can work remotely at home for a lot of the stuff that you need to do. That could be a new thing for Appalachia. I think we could have a Zoom revolution right here in Appalachian states. But in order to have people that are working from home remotely, I think that President Biden needs to invest in internet, and he needs to invest in technology resources for our people. So yeah, I think that I am cautiously optimistic. I believe that Joe Biden has the capacity to do a lot of good, but I think that at this point he needs to just decide to do it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to speak about the COVID-19 pandemic, how do you think that has affected further Appalachia and southern states in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of us we're feeling it pretty hard. A lot of our communities don't have access to good health care. There are people that have to drive an hour to get to a hospital in Appalachia. We don't have, I think my entire region of the state has less than 50 ICU beds. So when people, and that's a huge area, that's like 10 or 15 counties. And when you start looking at that and you realize that this virus is spreading, and as it continues to spread, we are not going to have hospital beds for everybody, and we don't have the healthcare to take care of people. Not to mention that a lot of people here are already can't afford healthcare. So when they get hit with something like COVID-19 that puts people out of work who already don't afford healthcare in an area where there's already not enough hospital beds, that's really, really problematic and really, really troubling. And so far, my town has been doing pretty well. I'm from a small university town that fortunately, due to the presence of the university, has a lot of resources that other communities don't get. But there are places around me, especially in those really rural communities, that badly need support and badly need aid. So a $600 stimulus check like we just got is not enough. We need structural change if we're going to survive this. But unfortunately, I think it's already been decided that the lives of many Americans are expendable, including those in the South and Appalachia.
Thank you very much for that. And I think a lot of southern countries and southern places in countries can relate to what you were saying and what you were describing, especially because a lot of people, again, I'm going to relate it back to Italy because I know a lot about it, where people were protesting because the government was shutting down for the second time. And a lot of Northern Italians were judging them, and they were like, oh, they don't care, they just want to party, they just want to be irresponsible. But that's not the reason why they were protesting. They were protesting because they work outside, they work in restaurants, they work with tourism, and the global shutdown or the national shutdown was actually affecting them to a point where they could not eat, they could not afford rent, they could not pay for their children to go to the doctor, to go to school. And there's a lot of people who don't understand those and just think that people that are protesting COVID lockdown measures are just ignorant. But there's a lot of people that just need it to survive. And it's either you die of hunger or you die of COVID. And some people just willing to take the risk, So I think this has been a really interesting interview. I personally have learned a lot that I did not know before, and I will keep into consideration anytime I speak about the states or southern parts of countries. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank y'all. You're doing great work. Keep it up, and I'm excited to see the video when it goes up.
Thank you.